we are going to discuss where this web API will fit in the big picture, and also understanding briefly how you would design and develop your HTTP-based APIs. And then we are going to work through a couple of demos using different applications ready built. The source code for which I think John already mentioned that you can download the source code for these demos I'm going to do and show. And then we are going to discuss as well how to use web API published information from other applications. So first of all, the web API. Well, the basic thing is that web API is part of this big ASP.NET family of different sub-technologies. So Web API also is running on top of the ASP.NET Core, meaning that all the basic functionalities you have in normal, so to speak, interactive web applications can also be used from Web API applications. However, the ASP.NET MVC, web forms, and so on, they are more or less designed for interactive use. So a person is using his or her web browser and then using the application you have been writing. However, you could, technically speaking, write, for example, MVC applications or web forms applications that output, for example, JSON-based or XML-based data. That has been possible for the very beginning of ASP.NET. But the new web API, which is more or less on the right-hand side of the slides, is the new thing to develop your web APIs. The idea is that with the web API set of libraries and classes, you can more easily build applications that are consumable by different applications or devices or whatever you have that is not interactive, so to speak. And this is the topic for the next hour, this more or less non-interactive way of displaying or sending out and accessing information. So for example, last time I was speaking in this room, I was talking about these small devices. This is a .NET Micro framework device running Micro Framework version 4.2 at this point, and for example, this is a good example of a small device that could be accessed through the web API. So you could even have this one running some of the server-side code. So it could be a client as well. So it's not only your own laptop or device running these services. It could be almost anything. For example, in the fashion of Internet of Things. Okay, understanding HTTP APIs. It might be that you have already designed these kind of applications, or it might be that you are just getting started with these kind of new HTTP-based APIs. The big idea with these HTTP-based APIs is that they can be accessed, like mentioned, from many different applications, many different devices, and so on. So HTTP more or less is today the de facto way of publishing and accessing different services. Obviously, there have been many during the years that HTTP has been available. There have been many different technologies. For example, XML-based web services, SOAP has been available for many years already, and so on. However, nowadays, lightweight kind of interfaces between different applications is more or less the aim for designing these things. And you might have heard about REST. It might be already a really familiar way of thinking for you. But you could say briefly that REST is about using HTTP protocol for the way it's more or less was designed originally. So with the ASP.NET Web API, you can build RESTful services in a highly efficient fashion if that's something you want to do. However, you can also use Web API for kind of more traditional way of thinking if that is something you prefer. But I would say that if you are designing new interfaces nowadays, or getting started with designing these interfaces, I think the ideology behind REST would be something that's useful for many situations. Okay, links between different parts of the service means that when you are publishing an API, it could be that you simply need one or two functions. But when your application and so the API that you are publishing is going to expand, then it might be beneficial to start to think how about the different parts of the API are going to fit together. And this means that, for example, if you would be publishing, let's say, a traditional corporate sales information system, for example, about sales orders and customers and so on, it might be beneficial for you to think about the sub parts of your API for fetching like customer data and order data and so on to link together, so that the consumer of these APIs could get all the information in an easy fashion. Of course, all this comes to the API design, and this is something that cannot be taught in 1 hour. However, this is something that to keep in mind when starting developing something with web APIs. That, for example, the versioning of different APIs, and for example documentation of your APIs is also one thing that should be thought from the very beginning, in my opinion. So for example, there are plenty of different web APIs that don't have that good documentation. So I always find that good documentation is always a good thing, obviously, but and at the same time, I know as a developer that it's the part of the application that is most easiest to skip. So it's something that might be a consideration for you as well when doing API design. ASP.NET Web API gives you good options in designing expandable and well-supported APIs through HTTP. So whether your client is a JavaScript or jQuery application on a web page accessing a backend somewhere, or whether it's a small device accessing directly some resources and controlling, for example, some kind of external hardware, it's all doable with the web API. And regarding these web APIs, the last bullet on the slide says HTTP status codes, and this is more or less related to the HTTP protocol itself. So I would say that in addition to also these status codes, you would need to think about HTTP verbs. Perhaps John mentioned about these, I'm not sure, but HTTP verbs are these so-called commands inside the HTTP protocol, and the most well-known ones are obviously get and post. So I would guess everybody here in this room is familiar with those two at least. But there is also many different verbs being defined in the request for comments or standard documentation. So for example, there is put and post and delete. And all this relates to the way you are architecting your web APIs. And status codes, obviously, there are plenty of many more status codes than 404 and 200 and 500. So there are plenty of status codes, and it might be beneficial for you to start to think when you are building ASP.NET Web API applications that you would use your HTTP status codes to the way they were designed to be used. So, for example, you don't need to define your own interfaces, how, for example, you would report back to a web API client that some resource, for example, has been created. You could simply return an already existing HTTP status codes 201, which means that a object has been created. So there is no need for basic operations like put and post and delete and create to define your own interfaces, how you would return information back from your API to the client. So instead, go ahead and use the HTTP ready-made status codes, because the client applications will already understand how to manage those. So there is no need for any custom development in that perspective. Okay, that's briefly about the HTTP API in general. And here is an example of defining a sample read-only model and a controller. I'm going to show you a example, obviously, very soon on this. But here is the basic information on this. So I do have a really simple model class, which in this case is a person, and the person has an ID number and a name. And then I do have my actual implementation class, like in ASP.NET MVC, which you have already seen here today. Contains these controllers. In Web API, you also have controllers. And in this case, I do have my person controller, but notice that how that has been descended from the API controller class. So that's slightly different than the normal MVC interactive use controller. So it's a different class. But then the other example on this one is that I do have my constructor, and I'm simply here as an example defining a static data. So some well-known persons in there being added. And then when I want to return this information about Chuck Norris, for example, I do have two action methods in my controller class. These are being automatically routed to, meaning that the ASP.NET routing functionality makes sure that these get executed when the URL addresses in the comments on top of the method name are being accessed. So here are two examples. In step 3, I'm defining something that would return a list of something. So okay, it's IEnumerable, but that's well, more or less a array or a list or a collection of something. And then I do have a more specific version of that method. So I do have a public method that returns a person object. Notice that there is no need to specifically define that anywhere for API purposes. I'm just defining it as a normal traditional C# class. And then I'm saying that, okay, my method returns a person object. And then there is a parameter defining the ID value for this person. And if I return to the previous one, the ID numbers 1, 2, 3 have been defined. So in this case, I'm using a simple link query to find the person object based on that ID value. So it could be a static data collection like I had in my previous slide, or it could be obviously a database or data store somewhere else. So this is the way to get going with these. And I think this is a really simple way of defining things. Okay, so this slide shows the example route, how it's being defined in the setup code for ASP.NET Web API applications. So what I'm saying here is that I'm defining a HTTP route named default API, and there is this route template, just like in normal MVC applications, that defines that, okay, if I'm accessing my application through the API, so to speak, folder, and then afterwards there is the controller and ID name, then that's automatically mapped to a specifically named controller. So for example, in this case, the address being shown here on on the web browser is /API/person. So the person one would be mapped to a person controller that was defined in the previous slides. So it's based on the name of the controller class, just like in MVC, for example. Okay. And then this is the arrows being displayed, how it's going. So the ID parameter has been marked optional, meaning that if I don't specify the number at the end, then I'm going to get the list of the persons. And here is a more detailed example on how you would return the actual HTTP response back. So in the previous slide in step 4, I think it was, I had this query to get the information, but I still need to return something to the client application accessing this data. And here is an example on how I would actually do that. So with these kind of quite simple code blocks, I can actually do pretty powerful web API applications. So notice that there is also at the bottom of this code example, there is also a example of how you would handle the situation of where I'm asking for a person with an ID that cannot be found. And notice here again, like I mentioned in the API design slide, is that I don't need to specify any special rules for how I would handle the situation. Instead, I return a HTTP status code not found, which obviously is the very familiar 404 for us. So the client application would then immediately know what's the situation. The ID that was specified wasn't found. So there is no need to come up with a custom error handling functionality or something like that. Okay, here is an more detailed example what's happening behind the scenes. We can look at this from the demonstration. So this one is showing through the development tools in IE. So, for example, the IE, I think it's from IE 10 or perhaps 9 version. In any case, the idea is the same. That whenever the call is successful, the return code is more or less 200, depending on what kind of query it is or whether it's a creation of some resource. But in any case, if I'm fetching something, it's 200. And then notice that this result is a JSON type of return. So I didn't need to specify anywhere that the application data that is being returned, for example, the person object, it's going to be JSON. That's something that a web API did automatically for myself. Obviously, I could hard code that. I could specify that it's always JSON or always some other format, or I can define a custom format. For example, if I'm interested in CSV, so comma separated values. That could be one option if I want to customize this. But JSON is more or less the default return value type. And notice that that's the information. If I would then have a jQuery, for example, client running on some HTML5 web application, for example, this data format could immediately be consumed in that application. Okay, and here is a quick example of what happens when there is a problem in accessing that resource. So, for example, the not found situation, the HTTP status code is 404, like mentioned, and then there is no data to return. So in JSON, that would be the null value. Okay, and here is an example of how you would implement a post. So in HTTP terms, the post would mean something like an edit or update of some resource. So the HTTP verb post could be used for that one, and I think it would be a great example of when to use post in your web API applications. So, for example, if you want to modify something. So, as a parameters, I'm defining in this C# code a person object and notice that the infrastructure in ASP.NET Web API does the basic work for me already. So I simply, in my C# code, need to manage the person object. I don't need to figure out how I'm going to encode that or decode that from JSON data or XML-based data or what else. It's already done for me, and then I can simply figure out how I would update my database based on the new information and so on. So this is a example on doing that. Okay, and this is a client example what happens. So there is a interactive HTML page, really simple one in a case, but does the work. So there is a field where the user can type in a new name and click the save button, in which case a JSON call or AJAX call, as you could also call it, is being made to the backend, and the Web API application is automatically getting a person object from that. So it's really easy actually to use these kind of functionalities in Web API applications. And well, there is an more detailed example on what's happening. So behind the scenes, the request body from the web browser is simply form encoded data. So notice at the top there is no JSON data directly. It's a simple form post operation. Okay, so I think it's time for a demo. So we'll do a demo starting from the scratch. So no ready-made code except anything that comes up from Visual Studio itself. So I'll go and go to the new project. And in here, let's see that I can see the whole screen. I need to do some adjustments afterwards, but in any case, I can get started with this one. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to start a new ASP.NET Web application, like John already had done previously, and I'm going to give that a type definition. So I'm going to select the template, and in this case I'm going to go through the Web API. I could also select an MVC application and expand that with the Web API selections. However, little less clicking if I go directly and select the Web API applications. Notice also I'm going to zoom in slightly, so it's easier for you to see, hopefully. Okay, I could also add unit tests. So again, if you are not currently doing any unit tests, then starting a new Web API application is, in my opinion, a great place to get started. So be sure to use unit tests as well. I can check in the box. I don't have the time to go today through the testing phases of these, but Web API applications. But in any case, that's something that could be discussed separately. Okay, so let me check that I can put my Visual Studio for the whole screen. Unfortunately, the projected image is slightly smaller than on my screen, so hope we can get managed. Okay. First things first, notice that this is now a Web API application. However, there is also a really handy project README page being written for you. So if this is going to be your first Web API application that you are ever doing, then it might be beneficial to figure out what kind of different options you have. So, for example, how you would get started with your Web APIs. For example, there is a help page in your application. How you would deploy it to cloud services. How you would make things more secure, and so on. So it's useful to do these kind of things and look at the project README file if you are not familiar yet with the Web API applications. Okay, the structure of this application, whether it's a web API application or a more traditional interactive use MVC application, the structure of the application is more or less the same. So you have controllers and you would have models. Well, obviously in an empty project it's empty, so I could add something there. But there is also a ready-made controller for me showing a trivial example of how to do things. So we could take a look at that one. So let me zoom in slightly, and then I'm going to show the whole screen. So it's probably easier this way. So you get the big picture first. Okay. So this is the sample values controller, and this class is put into the controllers folder. It doesn't need to be there technically speaking, but it's a nice convention, and for me, I haven't had the real need to put it anywhere else except perhaps in a larger application to some subfolder somewhere behind areas, for example. But for smaller applications, I think it's fine. Okay, so notice again. Controller classes must be descended from the API controller class, and this is something that lives simply in the system.web.http namespace. So okay, if I would navigate to that place, I can see a metadata constructed version of this one. And there are plenty of different options, and obviously this one is also implementing certain interfaces and so on. But that's not important for our demonstration at this point. However, what is important is that we have several methods implemented in here. Like in the slides, I do have a function or method called gets, which returns a list of values. Well, in this case it's super simple. I do have a string array and two values being defined, and then I do have a more specific version of that. I do have a gets and specifying a ID parameter. However, there is no code to check for the ID values or doing anything fancy. Instead, it always returns the same value. And additionally, there have been skeleton versions of basic functionality. So post more or less is could be for changing something and adding something, and then there is a delete functionality as well. So obviously you would need to fill in the meat into these methods, but they simply act as a placeholders for your future implementation. Without writing any code, if I would run my application, let's see what happens. So my web browser is starting, and notice that even though I selected that this is a web API application, I'm still seeing a interactive user interface or HTML user interface for my web API. Obviously, if you want to strip all this out, that's obviously doable and simple as deleting files. No problem in that. However, it might be useful to have whenever you are publishing a public API especially on the internet, it might be useful to have some kind of interactive web pages saying, for example, at least a company name and contact details and what else. So this is the basic starting point. And the interesting thing is that at the top there is a link called API, and if I click this link, fancy things will happen. So automatically, ASP.NET Web API is generating for me a list of the functionalities that is available in my Web API service. Obviously, I now have only the super simple values controller, so there isn't that many functionalities being listed. But if you would add a new controller, for example, it would be automatically listed here. Also, it will list all the public functions or methods, as you could call them as well, will automatically list them here. in addition to any documentation that you potentially give to them. And this documentation, I don't have any C# XML-based documentation, but if you wanted, you could add it in the traditional fashion. I would need to close the application to be able to edit the code now, but if you would type in the 3 /, then Visual Studio's code editor would expand that to the XML-based documentation comments. And that file, when you would go and specify, I can actually quickly show you the place. You would go to help page, app start, and help page config, and uncomment this first line over here, and slightly perhaps tune the URL address or path being displayed here. The web browser in here would be able to display the documentation for your API without doing anything else except writing the documentation. So it's kind of a way of easily or gently reminding you that the documentation would be a good thing, at least from the moment that you publish your API. Okay. If I would click some of these links in here, I would get an example of what kind of data is being returned. Okay, previously I have been discussing or mentioning that JSON is the default data format, or more or less the default data format for returning information from web API applications. However, also built in is a XML-based information display. And what actually happens is that if you closely look at these blue headers on top of these slides or parts of examples, you notice that there is being listed something as the MIME type or data type, content type on top of these examples. And actually it happens that in ASP.NET Web API there is something called content negotiation being or happening behind the scenes. And this negotiation basically is that the client's application accessing your web API sends information that, okay, I'm supporting this and this and this data format. What can you give to me? And based on this information, ASP.NET Web APIs by default can support 2 formats, JSON and XML. So if the client application says that, okay, I'm preferring XML-based information instead, then that's something that the API will automatically deliver. And as a developer, you don't need to do anything special to specify that both of these formats are supported. So that happens automatically. So for example, in the slides, I was returning this person object. So there is no code actually I need to do to support both of these. So if I return to my example code, notice that I'm simply in my C# application returning a array of strings. It could be a list of objects or what else you want to return from your application. But in any case, ASP.NET Web API will figure out automatically what's the correct format to return to this client. And actually a nice package from NuGet that you can install to your application is called Web API Test Client. And notice that this is all nice, that I can see what the sample data is going to be, but wouldn't be great that if I could actually try it out. So let's see if I can get this working. So I'm going to my Web API application, manage NuGet packages. And let's see if it can find the information. I'm working with a 4G connection. Yes, okay, it works. So Web API Test Client. Hit enter, and what I can see is that there is a simple test client for ASP.NET Web API applications. This is a free to use NuGet package, and if I simply say install, then it will start to download all the packages that are going to be needed. So there are certain dependencies like a help page API and Knockout.js and jQuery UI and so on. So that's the thing. So it now got installed everything. and then there is a README. I'm going to skip that now. Hopefully I have read that previously. And if I run my application again, I'm going to get myself to the root. So let's see. Okay, I'm back in this new API web page. If I would now go to my Get API Values, notice that a new button has been added to my application. There is a button saying Test My API. So if I click this button and then luckily things happen as planned. So I get a new pop-up window displaying a really simple HTTP debugging tool or testing tool as you see fit. And what I can do is that I can send in this case, it will take the currently active API function and automatically generate well, more or less correct function call using HTTP to my web API backend. And you know, there is the get request to this and this web address, and if I simply click the send button, it will display that okay, the HTTP status code is 200, yes it worked, and then I can see in the body, I can see my values. This is JSON coded data, so it's an array. And you can also see from the content type that it's application/JSON data. If I want to see my XML-based data, then I can click the add header function and say accept and specify application.xml, for example. Other things also work, so I could type in text/XML and a couple of more of these content types. But if I specify that my client application now wants the XML-based more or less instead of JSON, then notice that the same application code will return or run the same code, same method in my C# code, but it will automatically return XML-based data. So depending on your needs, obviously, you can specify that this and this functionality will only return XML or only return JSON, or you could enable both, because you never know what kind of preferences for the client there are. So this is more or less ready-made things, and obviously you can customize the XML. So if you have a ready-made schema that you already want to follow, then by all means. Also, if you want to develop your custom types, so for example, let's say you would return big amounts of information, so let's say images, for example. Well, you might want to compress them, for example, so you could implement something that compresses the data before it goes on the wire and so on. But this is what's being supported out of the box, so to speak. Okay. And then, similarly, I could go in a different function and access the test API button. Notice that I get some more additional parameters. I can type in the real data and so on. I didn't implement the put functionality in my application, but this is the idea how to get started. So I highly recommend using this test API client. So it was called Web API Test Client, and you need to type it more or less like without any spaces between the words. So it's easy for you to find that way. Okay, that was a super simple example of accessing or implementing your web APIs. So what I have next on the list is that I'm going to follow the geek quiz example that John already showed you. So there are a couple of examples on how you could actually support your applications in many different formats. So your client application, so to speak, could be a desktop application. It could be a Windows 8 store application. It could be an HTML application. It could be it could be an Excel application as well. So let's see a couple of examples. So first of all, I'm going to show you the more or less the back end. So again, this is the Geek Quiz application, and this is all public code. So if you want to go and download these codes, it's all doable. So feel free to ask me or John afterwards for the link. I think at least on the conclusion slides we have the link for these examples. So this is the Geek Quiz application, and there is, in addition to the basic values controller that I had previously, well, the values controller has been deleted, but there instead there is something called the trivia controller. And this trivia controller, let me zoom in slightly so it's easier for you to see. There is something that is more or less like an architectural choice on how to write your applications, but there is this idea of doing slightly more abstractions on top of the web API. So instead of doing all the database access and so on and so forth inside the controller classes, there has been defined some class called the question service. And the question service is actually something that lives in the models folder, I believe. Let's see. Yes, this is something that I wanted to show. So there is a simple question service based on a context object that has been created, and this service basically has you could say this is more or less like the business logic of part of the service. So it will return a quick next question for me, and well, it simply does it by calculating how many questions you have. So it's round robin kind of style, simple like that. But notice that there is a asynchronous functionality for that. So in Web API, as in normal Web API application, ASP.NET web applications nowadays, you can also use asynchronous functions if you want to make your applications more scalable and more performant in many ways. So that's also doable. Okay. So basically this is the information, and there are plenty of classes over here to model the answers for these questions, and then there is the context object which has been created using a scaffolding template and then being expanded. So to keep things simple, there is no database for the questions. Instead, the questions are being listed here, but that's not important for us, unless of course you want to cheat in the quiz. So you can see all the answers in here. But let me try out how this would work in my web browser first. So John already showed you how you would access this using the web browser. So I'm going to log in. I've created for myself a super secret password over here. Let's see if it works. Okay, loading question. First computer program. Unfortunately, no idea, I must confess, but let's try this one. Didn't work. Okay, Visual Basic was released. Okay, could be this one. No, didn't work out. Not a prime number. Okay, yeah, that works better. So this functionality has been implemented by using jQuery calls. And let me see if I can actually find that one over here. So let me zoom in slightly. So here is a quick example. I'm not going to go through all these because otherwise would run out of time. But the main thing here is that I do have a web URL address pointing directly to my API controller called Trivia Controller. and I'm specifying a certain properties in that call, but in any case it's going to be a JSON call. And then when there is a return, a successful return, I'm going to call my setProperties method of the question object. And then obviously that would be the functionality that would update the screen at some point. And then finally, if I'm clicking one of the buttons, one of the 4 buttons to mark my answer, it will then send out a new query to this Web API trivia controller class. So let me show that one as well. So let's go in here and go to the trivia controller. So in this case, what I do have is that here is the checking if this answer was correct. So if I wanted, I could put a breakpoint over here, for example, and then go back to my geek quiz and okay, and see if that one works. Probably not. But notice that in here, the Web API has already automatically generated for me a ready-made object that is already of the C# type, model type of trivia answer. So it has figured out that the user is answering for the question ID number 27, and the option ID that has been selected was 108. So the answer service class within my application will figure out whether that answer was correct, and also notice that it implements an asynchronous storing of that answer. So the interesting thing is that the GeekWiz application will collect statistics on the responses, and obviously, like you can saw, I don't get that good grades on this application, but that's not a problem because we can next see what kind of information has been collected to that database. Okay, but basically, again, the same rule follows. So I'm checking that if the model, meaning my trivia answer, is valid, meaning that I do have the question number and I do have the selected option number, I can check those, and obviously I could have plenty more complex things going on in my model state validation. But in any case, in this trivia context, it's pretty simple. Then I'm figuring out the logged in user. So notice that even though this is a Web API application, I can use the same well-known and tested and easy to use ASP.NET security settings. So for example, it's easy for me to figure out who has been the logged in user in my Web API. Then I'm doing the real logic, which is implemented in here. And then finally, as far as Web API functionality is concerned, I'm returning a value to the client, meaning the web application or the jQuery call. I'm returning that okay, the information has been stored and whether it was correct or not. If some bad things would happen, like disconnected database or network connectivity problems or what else, then I'm simply returning that's okay, a bad request, and returning the model state information. So for example, a answer was missing or something like that. So that's a good way of doing things. So, like you notice that even though this one public function in here implements pretty powerful things, the code that you write in the controller doesn't need to be complex. And in my opinion, that's the way it should be. So try to keep things simple in the controller classes. Instead, it's better to have your well, whether you call it business logic or services or what else inside your application to do the real grunt work on storing these. Okay, didn't work out. Good. Next up is a tuned up version of this web API application. And I'm going to open more or less the same application. However, what's interesting in this one is that I do have Office integration in this application. How many of you actually have been writing applications for Office, like Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, what else? Not that many hands. Okay, okay. Really briefly, in Office 2013, meaning the current latest version, there is a completely new application model for writing Office integrated applications. And briefly put, the new way of developing your applications is that you write your Office extensions or Office applications by using HTML5, JavaScript, and probably some kind of web API backend. So the idea is that, for example, Excel will host a web browser inside Excel, which will run your applications. So in this case, I do have a GeekWiz version for Office. Well, this is actually, you could say, the administration part of this application. I don't think you can actually play the quiz with Excel. That would be fun, I guess. But there is more or less this statistics display of information. And what's inside this application? Obviously, today's topic is not Office programming or Excel programming, but the idea is to show that the web API client can be almost anything. So, in this case, if I would go and select my GeekWiz web API application, notice that there are these familiar trivia controllers, but there are also some more functionalities to display user interfaces in Office. So, for example, there is a folder under Views folder called Office App, and there is an index.html and C# HTML. So this part of the application is the user interface that I'm using inside Excel. So let's see what happens if I actually run this application. So I'm going to hit Start. It will actually start two applications. It will start Excel, and it will also start the IIS Express. And notice that, yeah, let's put it here, like this. Notice that this is the new part. So there is a pane in Excel displaying the GeekWiz user interface. There is a fancier blue bar displaying the title, and there is a fun button called Update Statistics. Again, since this view that you can see here is HTML-based user interface, what is being done when I click this button is that I'm going to send out a jQuery back to my web API backend, the trivia controller, or the statistic controller, more accurately, and that controller would return the statistics of my answers. And let's see what actually happens. So if I click my button, fingers crossed, and hopefully shortly afterwards I get my statistics. So I've been playing around a bit, but unfortunately I haven't got that good scores. So perhaps you could help me slightly in this one. So let's go to my web browser. And where is my web browser? Okay, GeekWiz local application. Let's go over there and then log in. It's me, my password. Okay, let's see if that works. Okay, dynamic languages support. Any good answers for this one? What can you say? Any ideas from the audience? 2-0. Okay, let's try it. Whoops. Didn't work. It's not easy. It's not easy. Okay, Node.js, I might know this one. Okay, that's good. And let's try to add some incorrect answers. Oh, well, okay, I try this one. Okay. So, okay, this is, yeah, okay. This is probably fine. And then take good notes on this pie chart and also these bars over here. So I clicked update statistics. Yeah, okay, it worked. So no fancy effects because I got some correct answers as well. So you know, things happen when you are doing things by random. But well, it worked. So basically what's happening here, if I go and notice that this is very good for developers, you have the view source HTML for web applications as well inside Excel. So well, this is it has been put the scripts in the different files. But in any case, what would be happening here is that when I click this button, the query would go to my statistics controller, and then whoops, not over there, but geek quiz and statistics controller. Let's go in here and see what's being done. So in this case, there is a statistics view model, which is more or less a simple class to contain all these answers and total numbers, correct answers, and so on. The data, more or less, so to speak. And then it will simply calculate the statistics and then return that information. Okay, it wants to go there all the time. Okay, so this is basically the way you could develop your integrated applications to Office, for example. So you know, there are many possibilities on how to do things. And last but not least, I'm going to show you a really quick example on how you would develop a Windows Store application. So if you are already familiar with Windows 8 Store applications, in this case, my application is a HTML5 based application. So here is an example on how to use the Win.js libraries to define my user interface. And somewhere in here, there would be the code to actually call the Geek service backend or the trivia controller. And if I would now run this application, so that we don't run too much out of time, it's saying loading. Okay, yeah, this one is easy. Luckily, I know this one, and it will fetch again using the same kind of notion, using JavaScript, jQuery kind of calls to my web API backend. And again, this is a third example of a client application using all the same example in the backend. So okay, didn't work out. Let's see, didn't work. Okay, yeah, you get the idea. So. Oh, by the way, a new feature in Windows 8.1 update, you get these closing boxes for mouse use as well for your store applications. That's nice. Okay, didn't show, unfortunately. Yeah, it's the screen resolution. Sorry about that. Should have figured out that well. But in any case. Many client applications can support your web API. Obviously, this was all Microsoft technologies being shown, but no worries if you have other platforms being accessing this web API. So whether it's some different mobile platform or some real big machine somewhere accessing your data using HTTP. As long as you can figure out the XML and JSON data formats and you can support web-based access for HTTP, then it should well work out. So let's see. We did have a demo on the basic skeleton on the web API. We did have a demo on how the Geek Quiz services demo was built, at least briefly. And then we have had examples on how to consume those API interfaces from many different applications. So it could be a desktop application, VPF, Windows Store application, what else? So you name it basically. So I would say, at least my experience is that I'm highly happy with the web API. Obviously, not everything is perfect. So there are some still rough edges somewhere. But generally speaking, I've been happy with the way of using a fast way to develop web API functionalities and publishing them. And now that Visual Studio 2013 is also highly integrated with Azure, the cloud services, it's easy to publish your applications to or web APIs to those platforms as well. Okay, my time is more or less up, so I think it's Matt doing the next presentation. So thank you, and if you need to ask something, I think at this point would be a good place while Matt is doing his setup, or I'm going to spend a couple of minutes here afterwards if you want to come and ask something in private, for example. Okay, so thank you. Are there any questions at this point on the web API or other stuff, perhaps related? No? Okay. Hopefully the presentation was clear enough, so you didn't have any specific question needs. But I in any case suggest that you give it a try. So it's really easy to get started, because you simply need to start a new project and then play along with the code editor. So feel free to explore. Thank you.